A courtroom like no other. The trial of Elijah Gray begins. The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back rows, their notebooks open, cameras primed, and eyes locked onto the man at the defense table, Elijah Gray, the billionaire investor turned disgraced fraudster. A man who had once been hailed as a financial genius now sat in the cold, unforgiving reality of a courtroom, his fate hanging in the balance. The case had captivated the nation. Elijah Gray wasn't just any businessman. He had built an empire by promising security to those who had little left to lose. Families had entrusted him with their savings, retirees had invested their pensions, and small business owners had handed over their life earnings, all believing in the lies he spun. Now, they sat in the audience, watching as the man who stole their dreams faced the consequences. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the room, calling for order as the heavy wooden doors opened. Judge Maya Johnson, a formidable black female judge known for her no-nonsense approach to justice, entered the courtroom. Dressed in her traditional black robe, she carried an air of authority that demanded respect. The entire courtroom rose to their feet except for Elijah Gray. As the judge took her seat, Elijah remained comfortably slouched in his chair, flipping through a stack of legal notes as if he were reading stock reports rather than facing criminal charges. His arrogance was palpable, his smirk unwavering, and his disregard for the process clear. Even as his lawyer subtly nudged him to stand, he rolled his eyes, exuding an attitude of untouchability. Judge Johnson, however, was not one to tolerate disrespect. She let the silence stretch, her piercing gaze falling on Elijah, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. When he finally glanced up, his expression one of bored amusement, she spoke, her voice calm yet firm. "Mr. Gray, I suggest you familiarize yourself with courtroom decorum. Disrespect will not be tolerated here." A few whispers rippled through the audience, but Elijah merely smirked, leaning back in his chair. He had spent his life bending the rules, buying his way out of trouble, and assuming that his wealth placed him above the law. But today, that assumption would be tested. As the prosecution prepared to lay out their case, the first witness was called to the stand, Isabella Rivera, a widowed mother of 3. Her face was etched with exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of struggle, betrayal, and broken promises. She took her oath, her voice steady but laced with pain, and began to recount how Elijah Gray had destroyed her life. "He promised me security," she said, her voice echoing through the silent room. "He told me that my children's future would be safe. I invested everything I had, and in the end, I lost it all. We lost our home. I had to sleep in my car with my children for 2 weeks before I found help." From the defense table, Elijah barely looked at her, his fingers lazily drumming on the polished wood. To him, she was just another sucker, another desperate soul who had been foolish enough to believe in his schemes. But the jury was listening, the audience was listening, and Judge Maya Johnson was most certainly listening. Elijah's lawyer attempted to poke holes in Isabella's testimony, suggesting that she had made poor financial choices, but her unwavering gaze held firm. She wasn't here for pity, she was here for justice. And she wasn't alone. Hundreds of victims just like her were waiting for their turn to speak. As the first day of testimony ended, Elijah remained as smug as ever. He whispered something to his lawyer, then chuckled to himself as he exited the courtroom, seemingly unshaken by the weight of the evidence against him. But Judge Johnson took note of everything: his dismissiveness, his arrogance, his unwillingness to acknowledge the pain he had caused. The trial was only beginning, but already a shift was happening. The world was watching, the victims were speaking, and for the first time in his life, Elijah Gray was facing a force that not even his billions could buy his way out of justice. Elijah Gray's arrogance in the face of justice. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier as the trial continued. The testimonies of victims like Isabella Rivera had set the tone. This was not just a financial crime, but a calculated betrayal that destroyed lives. Yet, despite the gravity of the charges against him, Elijah Gray sat at the defense table completely unaffected, as if the entire trial were nothing more than an inconvenience to his otherwise luxurious life. Dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, his gold cufflinks gleaming under the courtroom lights, Elijah oozed entitlement. He lounged back in his chair, adjusting his tie with lazy confidence, barely acknowledging the people whose lives he had ruined. To him, this trial was a joke, a game he had already won before it even started. As Paul Vincent, a retired firefighter, took the stand, Elijah barely concealed a yawn, flipping through a notepad as if he were reviewing business deals instead of listening to a man recount how he had lost his entire retirement savings. "Mr. Gray told me it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," Paul said, his voice strained with frustration. "I spent decades running into burning buildings, saving lives, knowing I had a pension waiting for me. But he stole that. I had to move in with my brother. I lost everything." Paul's voice cracked with emotion, and for the first time, the jury members shifted in their seats, their expressions hardening. They weren't just listening to numbers on a balance sheet, they were hearing about real, devastating losses. But Elijah didn't flinch. He smirked, shaking his head slightly, as if Paul's suffering was an overreaction. When his lawyer leaned in and whispered something, Elijah chuckled quietly, shaking his head again, making a dismissive gesture. Judge Maya Johnson, ever observant, took note of his behavior. Her sharp eyes followed his every move, every smirk, every sign of disrespect. "Mr. Gray," she finally said, her voice steady but laced with unmistakable authority. "Is there something amusing about this testimony?" The courtroom fell silent. Elijah looked up lazily, raising an eyebrow. "Just finding it hard to keep track of all these sob stories, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I mean, really, people make bad investments all the time. That's the market, isn't it?" Gasps rippled through the audience. The families of his victims stared in disbelief. Even his own lawyer, who had been doing his best to keep Elijah's ego in check, rubbed his forehead in frustration. Judge Johnson's expression remained impassive, but the steel in her eyes intensified. "Let me remind you, Mr. Gray, that this is a court of law, not a boardroom. If you continue to treat these proceedings with disrespect, you will be held in contempt." For the first time, Elijah's smirk faltered, but only for a brief moment. He leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference, but the warning had landed. The prosecution continued, presenting email evidence in which Elijah referred to his clients as suckers and fools who deserved to be fleeced. Even the most reserved jury members tightened their jaws, their disgust for him growing with every new revelation. Yet, Elijah remained as smug as ever. When the lunch recess was called, he stood leisurely, buttoning his jacket, turning toward his lawyer. "You're worrying too much," he said with a smirk. "They're not gonna lock me up. People like me don't go to prison." Judge Maya Johnson overheard him as she walked past. She didn't react, but deep down she knew something. Elijah didn't. His money couldn't buy him out of this one. The trial was only beginning, but already his arrogance was sealing his fate. The evidence unfolds. Elijah Gray's downfall begins. As the second day of the trial began, the mood inside the courtroom had shifted. The smug arrogance that Elijah Gray carried the previous day was still present, but now it was beginning to falter. He may not have realized it yet, but the weight of his crimes was closing in on him. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting damning evidence, emails, financial records, and private messages that showed how deliberately Elijah had orchestrated one of the largest fraud schemes in recent history. His operation wasn't just misguided business decisions or market risks. It was a carefully planned deception, designed to exploit those who trusted him the most. As the court clerk handed stacks of printed emails to Judge Maya Johnson, the lead prosecutor stepped forward, clearing his throat before reading aloud. From Elijah Gray to his board of executives, these people are so desperate to believe they'll be rich that they'll sign anything. It's laughable, really. They don't even ask questions. By the time they realize it's a scam, we'll already be counting our profits. Gasps filled the courtroom. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. A man in the back shook his head, whispering angrily to the person next to him. But Elijah? He barely reacted. Sitting at the defense table, he simply adjusted his cufflinks, glancing toward his attorney, as if mildly inconvenienced by the situation. Judge Johnson, however, wasn't blind to his demeanor. "Mr. Gray," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you have any response to this email?" Elijah lifted a shoulder in a nonchalant shrug. "Sounds like a business conversation to me." The silence that followed was deafening. The prosecutor narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to the jury box. "Mr. Gray, are you suggesting that calling your own investors as suckers and easy marks is just business?" Elijah sighed dramatically, as if the entire situation bored him. "People lose money in investments all the time," he said, his tone dismissive. "They should have been more careful. I'm not responsible for their bad decisions." A murmur spread through the audience, a mixture of disbelief and anger. Judge Johnson's expression remained neutral, but her eyes darkened. "Let the record reflect that the defendant has shown no remorse for his actions," she stated, her voice sharp. At that moment, another witness was called to the stand, Paul Vincent, the retired firefighter whose pension had been wiped out because of Elijah's fraudulent investment scheme. Paul walked to the stand with quiet dignity, his steps slow but steady. A man who had spent his life saving others was now standing before the court, having lost everything because of one man's greed. As he took a seat, the prosecutor approached him. "Mr. Vincent, can you tell the jury how your life has changed since investing with Elijah Gray?" Paul let out a slow breath, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "I worked 35 years in service," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. I never thought I'd have to worry about retirement. I trusted him, I believed him, and now I have nothing." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. For the first time, even the jury looked visibly shaken. The prosecutor nodded, letting Paul's words settle before continuing. "And where are you living now, Mr. Vincent?" Paul swallowed hard. "With my brother," he admitted. "I lost my house last year." The prosecutor turned back to Elijah. "Mr. Gray, does this sound like just another bad investment to you?" Elijah rolled his eyes, shifting in his chair. "Look, it's unfortunate, sure, but no one forced him to invest. I didn't hold a gun to his head." A gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by hushed conversations and shaking heads. Judge Johnson sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose before looking directly at Elijah. "Mr. Gray, I suggest you choose your words more carefully," she said, her patience running thin. But Elijah had already made his stance clear. He had no remorse, no regrets, and certainly no concern for the people he had wronged. As the trial continued, one thing became apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Elijah Gray wasn't just guilty. He was unapologetically corrupt, and his arrogance might be the very thing that would seal his fate. The turning point, Judge Maya Johnson holds Elijah Gray accountable. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The testimonies had been delivered, the evidence laid bare, and yet Elijah Gray remained unshaken, untouched by the pain and suffering he had caused. His indifference wasn't just a display of arrogance, it was a calculated performance, a belief that his wealth and influence would shield him from consequences, just as they always had before. But Judge Maya Johnson was not one to be intimidated. A woman of unwavering integrity, she had spent years on the bench presiding over cases where powerful men tried to manipulate the system, believing the rules did not apply to them. Elijah was no different. From the moment he entered her courtroom, his smug demeanor, his refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of his crimes, and his blatant disrespect for the victims had not gone unnoticed. And now, as the final day of the trial arrived, it was time for consequences to be delivered. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled with victims, reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had followed the case from the beginning. Elijah, still dressed in his expensive suit, sat confidently at the defense table, his lawyer whispering last-minute advice in his ear. He barely looked up, casually flipping through papers as if this were just another business meeting. Then Judge Johnson spoke. "Mr. Gray, please stand." Elijah did not move right away. It was a small act of defiance, a final display of his belief that he was in control. His lawyer nudged him, and with an exaggerated sigh, he rose slowly, adjusting his cuffs as if the moment were an inconvenience rather than a life-altering event. Judge Johnson did not react. She had seen men like him before. She had sentenced men like him before. She began speaking, her voice steady and deliberate. "Mr. Gray, you were given the trust of hard-working people, people who believed in your promises, who put their savings, their pensions, and their futures in your hands. Instead of acting with integrity, you saw them as prey." Elijah's smirk wavered, just slightly. "The evidence in this case has been overwhelming. Your own words, emails referring to your investors as his suckers, dismissing their losses as not your problem, paint a clear picture of who you are. You have shown no remorse. You have mocked these proceedings, and you have disrespected the very concept of justice." For the first time, Elijah's fingers twitched, gripping the edge of the table. This was not going the way he had planned, Judge Johnson continued, her eyes locked onto his. "The law exists to protect people from those who believe they are above it. And today, Mr. Gray, you are going to learn that the law applies to you as well." A hush fell over the room. Even the reporters, who had been furiously taking notes, momentarily stopped writing, realizing that something monumental was about to happen. Judge Johnson's expression did not waver as she delivered the sentence. "Elijah Gray, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, all liquid assets under your name will be seized and used as restitution for your victims." The room erupted. Gasps, stunned murmurs, even a few scattered cheers broke out from the audience. Victims clutched one another, some weeping openly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For many of them, this moment seemed impossible justice against a man who had seemed untouchable. Elijah stood frozen, the reality of the sentence finally hitting him. His hands clenched into fists, his confident smirk vanished, replaced by something that almost resembled panic. Then he exploded. "This is a joke!" he shouted, slamming his hands onto the table. "You can't do this. I'll appeal. I have lawyers. This isn't over." Judge Johnson remained unmoved. "Take him into custody." The bailiffs moved swiftly, stepping toward Elijah, who was still ranting, his voice laced with pure disbelief. As he was led away, his shouts faded, drowned out by the sound of the courtroom erupting into applause. For the victims, for Isabella Rivera, for Paul Vincent, for the hundreds of others who had suffered because of his greed, justice had finally been served. And for Judge Maya Johnson, this was not just about one man's crimes. This was about proving that the system could work, that justice did not belong only to the powerful, and that no amount of money or influence could erase accountability. Elijah Gray had spent his life believing that the rules did not apply to him. Today, he learned that they did. The aftermath of justice: a billionaire falls, a community rises. The gavel had fallen, the sentence had been delivered, and Elijah Gray, once one of the most powerful men in the financial world, was now a convicted felon. The courtroom erupted into a wave of emotion, gasps of disbelief, murmurs of shock, and most powerfully, the sound of long-awaited justice settling into the hearts of those he had wronged. Among the crowd, Isabella Rivera clutched her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For years, she had carried the weight of her loss, of the betrayal that left her homeless, struggling to feed her children. Now, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. The man who had shattered her life was finally being held accountable. Beside her, Paul Vincent sat still, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. The retired firefighter, who had spent decades saving lives only to have his own future stolen, felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. It would never bring back his savings, but it proved something even more valuable: that no one, not even a billionaire, was above the law. Elijah, however, was not ready to accept his fate. Even as he was led away by bailiffs, his outrage filled the air like static electricity. "This is a setup," he barked, his voice laced with a desperation that had never existed before. "I'll appeal. You haven't heard the last of me. You can't do this to me." But the courtroom had already moved on from his theatrics. As the doors closed behind him, sealing him off from the world he once controlled, the realization finally seemed to sink in. For the first time in his life, Elijah Gray was powerless. A community restored as people began filing out of the courtroom. The atmosphere shifted from anger to quiet reflection. The victims, though still carrying the burdens of what had been taken from them, felt something new: hope. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, reporters swarming, microphones extended, waiting for reactions. But instead of anger or despair, they were met with something remarkable: solidarity. A journalist approached Isabella Rivera, who stood with her children clinging to her arms, their faces showing both relief and exhaustion. "Mrs. Rivera, how do you feel after today's verdict?" She wiped away a tear, taking a breath before answering. "I feel like I can finally tell my kids that justice is real." Her words echoed through the crowd, resonating not just with the victims, but with an entire community that had watched the trial unfold. Beside her, Paul Vincent placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, nodding to the cameras. "It won't bring back what we lost," he said, "but it proves that people like him don't always win." The crowd cheered, not in celebration of a man's downfall, but in recognition of their own resilience. For too long, they had been ignored, dismissed, treated as numbers in a system that favored the rich. But today, they were more than victims. They were survivors. Judge Maya Johnson's reflection. In her chambers, Judge Maya Johnson removed her robe and sat down, exhausted but satisfied. She had presided over countless cases, but this one felt different. She knew that justice wasn't always perfect. It couldn't erase the pain Elijah Gray had inflicted, nor could it restore everything his victims had lost. But it could send a message, a powerful one: that accountability exists, no matter how wealthy or untouchable someone may seem. She reached for an envelope sitting on her desk. It had been handed to her after the sentencing, a letter from Sophie Rivera, Isabella's daughter. She unfolded the note and read the words carefully. "Dear Judge Johnson, thank you for showing me that the law isn't just for the rich. Thank you for helping my mom believe in fairness again. You didn't just punish a bad man today. You gave us hope." A rare smile touched the judge's lips. Elijah Gray had lost, but today justice had won. The ripple effect of justice: a community rebuilds. The echoes of Elijah Gray's conviction lingered far beyond the courtroom walls. His sentencing had not only removed a corrupt billionaire from society, but it had also restored faith in a system that many had begun to doubt. For years, his victims had felt powerless, watching their savings vanish while he flaunted his wealth. Now, for the first time, they felt heard. They felt seen. Outside the courthouse, victims gathered together, no longer bound by shared misfortune, but by a newfound sense of justice and solidarity. Among them stood Isabella Rivera, the widowed mother who had once slept in her car with her children after trusting Gray's false promises. For so long, she had lived with anger, regret, and shame, blaming herself for believing in him. But today, as she stood alongside others who had suffered the same fate, she realized that none of them had been foolish, only deceived. "We can start again," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We don't have to live under his shadow anymore." Beside her, Paul Vincent, the retired firefighter, nodded. "It won't be easy," he admitted, "but at least we know he's paying for what he did. That's something." The victims weren't just leaving the courthouse with a verdict, they were leaving with closure. Judge Maya Johnson's lasting impact. As the news spread, Judge Maya Johnson's decision was met with widespread praise. Her unwavering stance against Elijah Gray's arrogance and lack of remorse had set a precedent, a message that wealth does not grant immunity from justice. Her ruling was discussed on television panels, written about in editorials, and debated among legal scholars. Some called it a landmark case, one that could reshape how financial crimes were prosecuted in the future. Others simply called it justice, long overdue. For Judge Johnson, it wasn't about making history. It was about ensuring that no victim would ever feel powerless in her courtroom. And for those who had suffered at Elijah Gray's hands, it meant everything. Justice wasn't just served, it was restored. The aftermath of justice, healing and moving forward, the days following Elijah Gray's conviction were unlike anything his victims had ever imagined. For years, they had endured humiliation, financial ruin, and shattered dreams, all while Gray continued to live a life of excess and luxury. Now, he sat in a prison cell, stripped of his power, while the people he had wronged took their first steps toward rebuilding their lives. The courtroom may have delivered its final verdict, but for Isabella Rivera, Paul Vincent, and the hundreds of others affected, the journey was far from over. The money Elijah had stolen wouldn't magically return overnight, and for many, the damage was irreversible. But something more profound had happened. They had been heard, and justice had been served. For the first time, they were not just victims, they were survivors. A community rebuilt outside the courthouse. A small gathering formed in front of a local support center, one that had been created for the victims of Elijah Gray's schemes. Families who had once lost everything now had a place to turn to. Lawyers volunteered their time. Financial advisors helped those affected regain control of what little they had left. And for the first time in years, hope began to replace despair. Isabella Rivera stood at the entrance, her children clinging to her side. The woman who had once felt invisible, who had struggled to provide for her family after losing everything, now stood as a symbol of resilience. When a reporter approached her, microphone in hand, she didn't hesitate. "What do you feel now that Elijah Gray is in prison?" She exhaled, glancing down at her youngest daughter before looking up with quiet determination. "Relief, but also responsibility," she said. "People like him exist because they think no one will stand up to them. We proved them wrong." The words struck a chord, not just with those in the crowd, but with everyone following the case. This wasn't just about punishing one corrupt billionaire. It was about sending a message that the voices of ordinary people mattered. Judge Maya Johnson's reflection across town. In her quiet office, Judge Maya Johnson sat at her desk, reflecting on the trial. As a black female judge, she had presided over many difficult cases, but this one was different. Elijah Gray had walked into her courtroom believing himself untouchable, above the very laws that governed everyone else. He had smirked through testimonies, dismissed his victims as mere nuisances, and carried himself as though his wealth would protect him from consequences. But not this time. She glanced at a letter sitting on her desk, the letter that had been hand-delivered to her after the trial. It was from Sophie Rivera, Isabella's daughter. Unfolding the letter, she read, "Dear Judge Johnson, thank you for believing in people like my mom. For a long time, I thought rich people always won, and that nothing we said would ever matter. But you proved that the law is for us, too. You made my mom feel like a person again. And because of you," she's smiling for the first time in a long time. Judge Johnson let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the words. This was why she did what she did. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about restoring dignity to those who had been wronged. Elijah Gray's fate, meanwhile, in a small, sterile prison cell, Elijah Gray sat on a stiff metal cot, staring at the concrete walls. The expensive suits, the luxury penthouses, the private jets, everything that had once defined him, were gone. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. No lawyers to buy his way out. No money to manipulate the system, just time and regret. The same reporters who once flocked to his lavish fundraisers now covered his fall from grace. Investors who once fought for his attention now fought to reclaim their stolen money. The world had moved on, and for the first time, Elijah Gray was nothing more than another name in a long list of criminals who had believed they were above the law. A new beginning justice had been served, but the true victory lay in the people who had refused to stay silent. Isabella, Paul, and the countless others were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had reclaimed: their dignity, their voice, and their hope. Judge Maya Johnson had sent a message not just to Elijah Gray, but to anyone who believed power could shield them from consequences. The law is for everyone, and on that day, justice had truly prevailed. Justice beyond the courtroom. A community begins to heal. The conviction of Elijah Gray sent shockwaves across the nation, but for his victims, it was more than just a legal outcome. It was a long overdue moment of justice. For years, they had lived under the weight of financial ruin, watching as the man who deceived them continued to live in luxury and arrogance. Now, with his sentencing, a new chapter began, one of healing, restitution, and hope. In the days following the trial, Judge Maya Johnson's ruling sparked national conversations. Legal experts debated the significance of the case, calling it a landmark moment in white-collar crime prosecution. Many believed it set a precedent that even the wealthiest could not escape justice. But for the victims, the real victory was not in the headlines. It was in the small, tangible ways their lives were beginning to change. A community rebuilds. At a support center for financial crime victims, Isabella Rivera sat with a financial advisor, reviewing documents that would allow her to receive compensation from the assets seized from Elijah Gray's estate. It would not restore everything she had lost, but it was enough to help her rebuild. Across the room, Paul Vincent spoke with a housing counselor, discussing his options now that some of his stolen retirement savings would be returned. For years he had felt powerless, ashamed of how easily he had trusted Elijah's false promises. But now he saw a path forward, a second chance to regain his independence. For the first time in a long time, hope replaced despair. Judge Maya Johnson's lasting impact at her desk. Judge Maya Johnson reflected on the trial, knowing that this case had set a powerful precedent. It was not just about punishing one man, it was about restoring faith in the legal system for those who had lost it. Among the many letters she received was one from Sophie Rivera, Isabella's daughter. It read, "Dear Judge Johnson, thank you for proving that people like my mum matter." She cried when she heard the sentence, but this time they were happy tears. "You gave us hope again." Judge Johnson folded the letter carefully, taking a deep breath. This was why justice mattered. Not just for the punishment, but for the hope it restored in those who had suffered. The lasting power of justice, integrity, and accountability life has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried. Throughout history, we have seen individuals rise to power through deception and greed, only to fall when their actions catch up with them. The case of Elijah Gray serves as a reminder that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can escape accountability forever. For years, Gray used his influence, charm, and financial expertise to manipulate people, convincing them to trust him with their life savings. Many believed his promises, only to be left with nothing when his schemes unraveled. Families lost their homes, retirees saw their pensions vanish, and small businesses crumbled, all because of one man's greed. And yet, he never showed remorse. He believed, like so many before him, that his money would protect him from justice. But justice, when applied fairly, is stronger than money. The lessons we can learn while Elijah Gray's story is one of greed, arrogance, and downfall. The lessons we take from it are about integrity, resilience, and the power of standing together. No one is above the law for too long. People have witnessed the wealthy escape consequences, while ordinary individuals are held accountable for far less. Gray believed his status made him untouchable. He mocked his victims, dismissed the trial as a formality, and even laughed at the suffering he caused. But in the end, he faced the same justice as any other criminal. This case reminds us that the law should serve everyone, not just those with power. A society that enforces justice fairly is one that earns the trust of its people. 2. The strength of ordinary people matters. Elijah Gray's victims were teachers, retirees, small business owners, and single parents, people who had worked hard their entire lives. At first, many felt hopeless, believing there was no way to fight back against someone so powerful. But when they came together, their voices became impossible to ignore. They testified, they demanded action, and they refused to be silent. In the end, their courage brought down a man who had spent his life preying on others. This lesson applies to life beyond the courtroom. When good people stand together, they can bring about real change. 3. Character defines legacy, not wealth. Elijah Gray had everything: money, influence, a life of privilege. But what did it bring him in the end? Nothing but disgrace and a prison cell. Meanwhile, Judge Maya Johnson, the victims, and the people who fought for justice will be remembered for their courage and integrity. As we grow older, we understand that our legacy is not measured by how much money we make, but by the impact we leave behind. Will we be remembered for helping others, for standing up for what is right, for leading with kindness and fairness? Or will we, like Gray, be remembered for taking from others and ignoring what is just? 4. Justice restores hope. When Judge Maya Johnson sentenced Elijah Gray, she didn't just punish one man, she restored faith in the system. She reminded people that justice still exists, that right and wrong still matter. For people like Isabella Rivera and Paul Vincent, who had lost everything, the sentence wasn't just about punishment, it was about being seen, being heard, and knowing their pain was not ignored.